This is part 2 of the history of Aikido. If you haven't already, please consider liking and subscribing to Dane Hardin Martial Arts on YouTube. On this video, we will take a look at the development of Aikido throughout medieval Japan and up to the modern era. Sensei's pursuit of martial arts skill sets led him to study many different styles of martial arts. Gozo Shioda himself was a sandan in judo before he came to martial arts study in Aikido. Nishio Sensei was a karate man before he came to Aikido. In Musashi Miyamoto's pinnacle book, Gorin no Sho, which is the Book of Five Rings, he really looks at different aspects of martial arts and kind of combines them, such as the first book, which is the Book of Wood, which talks about structure, and he finishes with the idea of the Book of the Void, or the Spirit, the Shin. There were many such books that were written for instructional purposes, such as the Hagakuri, or something that's hidden beneath the leaves. Many of the skill sets developed for Aikido were from the Heian period and the Kamakura period. It was at that time that the cherry blossom was adopted as a symbol of the fragility of life, its fleetingness, and also its beauty, the idea of Bushido. Bushido would later be enumerated upon by Inazo Nitobe in his highly romanticized book on Bushido from the late 18th century called Bushido, the Soul of Japan. If you haven't read it, you probably should. It's an excellent read. Let's talk a little bit about Ju Heipon, which is the idea of first master 18 martial arts. In Section 1, we introduced Shinra Minamoto Yoshimitsu, otherwise known as Shinra Saburo Yoshimitsu. He would work with the Minamoto clan in helping to develop a technique that would have been at that time referred to as kume-uchi, which is ancient striking arts. These were developed from the heritage of the sumo. They would eventually become known as shiki-uchi, or palace arts, because they were kept among the Minamoto family, and as eizu tadome, meaning secret techniques, they were not allowed to be trained outside of the family itself. At this time, you begin to see some of the things that were interesting and rather gruesome. One of the things that Yoshimitsu the spider did was to dissect the bodies on the battlefield. He learned about wrist structure, about nerve roots, about ranges of motion, and about the way that the bones and muscle could compress nerve roots and create extreme pain on individuals in order to control and or submit the individual on the battlefield. These are some pictures of cadaverized human bodies showing the musculature. During the period of the Senkoku Jidai, which was the Warring States period, the Japanese were so busy fighting each other that it made it more easy for foreigners like Christians to move into Japan and begin their missionary work to try to influence the Japanese. Also, at about that same time, you had foreign traders from the Portuguese black ships that would try to establish trade ports with Japan as well. They were there for nearly 100 years before they actually really became an annoyance and would eventually be banned from the kingdom, and it would lead to the idea of Japanese isolationism. Martial arts and martial skill sets would develop to an extreme razor's edge during what was called the Sengoku Jidai. That was the Warring States period in Japan. It's interesting to note that the most fleeting secrets of all secrets are martial or warrior secrets. During wars, the enemy will develop a certain way to attack an individual, and that individual will learn from those attacks and create ways to defend against us. This is something that I learned all too well during my service in Bosnia and Kosovo, Iraq, and Afghanistan. When we look at the various shogunates, it was the Minamoto clan that really established these Aizu Todome, which were the idea of secret skills that would be kept among the Minamoto family for hundreds of years. The overall shogunates, and there were dozens of these throughout the different periods, lasted about 700 years. And Aikido really can develop its roots back to the Heian period and some of the more refined roots into the Kamakura period. It was really later during the Tokugawa period that you would have some of the martial skill sets that would begin to be shared with areas outside of the family. The last shogun was a Tokugawa shogun, and he would be forced to open Japan to the rest of the world when Admiral Perry decided to dock his black ship. That would lead to the Meiji Restoration. Tokugawa Ieyasu is perhaps one of the most influential of all the shoguns. You may not specifically have heard of Tokugawa Ieyasu, but you have certainly heard of the book Shogun and the movie series that were done that were based on the life of Tokugawa Ieyasu. It was that shogun who would actually unify Japan and would lead Japan into a peaceful era of nearly 250 years. It would not be until the end of that period of the Sokoku, which was this idea of the isolation of Japan. They did not want influence from outside powers. It would be until Admiral Perry parked his black ships in Edo Bay that you would have this force of opening for trade and for influences from outside of Japan at the end of the Tokugawa shogunate. It's interesting that this Sokoku, or the closed feudal society era, also occurred in Korea because at that time Korea was known as the Hermit Kingdom. The Kokugaku during the Tokugawa shogunate was also something that's interesting. These black ships basically forced Japan to open by initially firing a volley of blanks from numerous cannons. Japan had realized at that time that they had no way to defend against Admiral Perry. He gave them a warning. He returned in a year, and it would be this break that would allow the Meiji Restoration to occur, and that would eventually lead to the Boshin War, which would be the war between the classical samurai and the modern era of Japan, which was born when Admiral Perry dropped his anchor in the middle of Edo Bay. So guys, we're now to the part where Admiral Perry has dropped anchor in Tokyo Bay, which back in that time it would have been called Edo. What's interesting is that when they moved the capital from Kyoto to Edo, Kyoto is spelled Kyoto, the old capital. When they moved that to Edo, they took Kyoto and they reversed the two parts of that word and put to ahead of Kyo. So instead of Kyoto, now you have Tokyo. So Tokyo then becomes the new capital. What's interesting when you think about this from the standpoint of historical impact, I can remember when I was in Command and General Staff College in the military, we always learned about these things called third order effects. The third order effect is you do one thing and you expect this to happen. But you do that one thing, and what you don't know about is this third thing that could also happen. So Admiral Perry cruises in, has superior firepower, forces the Japanese to open their ports and to begin trading with the Western powers. And through that, you have this rapid Westernization of Japanese culture, of Japanese civilization, and most certainly of the Japanese military. They begin to become imperialist in their views. If you think about what was going on in the 1860s and the 1870s in that part of the world, Korea at that time was the hermit kingdom, and they were also being forced to open their ports to the West. And so Japan had this notion that to become a proper Western power, they needed to colonize, they needed to become imperialistic, and so they start looking to the south. And one of the first places that they colonized would be the Ryukyuan Islands, which we know as Okinawa. And they went further down into Taiwan, and they moved over and began an annexation around 1910 or so of Korea. And so they were spreading this idea of imperialistic views, and they were really doing what it was that the West had kind of taught them through our example of overwhelming power and forcing the Japanese to open their borders. A lot of this stuff is interesting because at about the time that all this is happening, Ueshiba Sensei, O-Sensei, is born into that time period where you have this rapid expansion of Japan. And it's interesting to me that when you look at this, you have this modernization of the Japanese military. And you know, we had just mentioned the Boshin War, which is really, if you saw that movie, The Last Samurai with Tom Cruise, that's sort of a romanticization of what happened in the Boshin War. But it is true that there were these holdout samurai who held on to these traditional values of Bushido and of the samurai ways. And they fought that modern army of Japan, and of course, you know, they lost. So the Japanese, over the period of years, began to expand. They would eventually expand into Manchuria, and of course, in the next video, we're going to talk about O-Sensei and his life. And he spent some time in Manchuria where he was actually a prisoner and almost died there, but just as luck would have it, he was able to get out of Manchuria because some very high-ranking Japanese would err on his favor there in Manchuria and negotiate and get he and a gentleman named Onisaburo Deguchi, who we're going to talk about on the next video about O-Sensei's life, out of that prisoner of war camp. Otherwise, they could have both been killed. So what happens is you have this expansion, and then the West, the US, we realize that the Japanese are becoming more and more powerful. Well, they end up fighting a war in 1905, 1904 with the Russians. Well, everybody expected that the Russians would actually win that Russo-Japanese war. And that war, again, is influential with O-Sensei because O-Sensei actually ended up in the military and served in that conflict. And I think, and I'm going to explain that in part 3 of this video about O-Sensei's life, that war and those war experiences created symptoms that to me seem an awful like post-traumatic stress disorder, where you have this young man who comes back from combat and it's changed him in ways that he didn't think it was going to change him. And he starts looking at martial arts differently as well, what we might call PTSD, and its influences on the way O-Sensei would then from that point forward view what the purpose of martial arts should be and or what it could be. So guys, that's kind of where we're at right now with all of this. Of course, the Japanese would go on to win that Russo-Japanese war, and that would lead them into this modern era. And you know, we start getting into issues with Japan over oil. We were their main supplier of oil, and we started restricting the supplies of oil because we didn't like what the Japanese were doing with their massive colonization. And of course, the Japanese didn't like us restricting their resources. And so they were looking for other areas like Manchuria as a resource-rich area to expand into. All of this would, of course, lead to World War II and all of the things that happened in that war. So guys, on the next video, we're going to introduce Morihei Ueshiba at his birth. We're going to talk a little bit about some of his teachers, Onisaboru Deguchi, who was his religious teacher, and then a gentleman named Sokaku Takeda, who would be his martial arts teacher. And Sokaku Takeda was a direct inheritor of the Daito-ryu Aiki Jiu-Jitsu, which was named after the Daito Castle and can be traced back to the Minamoto clan and the things that we just got done talking about with the secret techniques and the secret skills. All of these things would meld together to really form what we now call Aikido, which is this amalgamation of the sword, the knife, the jo, or staff, empty hand combative techniques, jiu-jitsu techniques, judo techniques, Shingan-ryu techniques. All of these things would be really what we would call a mixed martial art that O-sensei put together with his own recipe and came up with the concept of Aikido as we currently know it. We're going to talk about that on our next video, where we're going to detail the life and times of Morihei Ueshiba, the father of Aikido. Guys, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed part 2 on the history of Aikido.